I live alone in a small house that I moved into a few years ago. It's in a fairly normal neighborhood, nothing particularly isolated or creepy about it, which is probably why what happened felt even stranger. At the time, I had only been living there for around 6 months, and I was still getting used to the area. One night, completely out of nowhere, I woke up to an extremely loud banging sound coming from downstairs. At first, I was disoriented and half asleep, so it took me a moment to realize what I was hearing. Someone was pounding on my front door, not knocking. Actually pounding. The sound was aggressive enough to wake me instantly. I checked my phone for the time. It was just before 2 a.m. That immediately made me uneasy. Nobody visits at that hour unless something is seriously wrong. I got out of bed and stood there listening for a moment while the banging continued. It was loud, fast, and constant, like whoever was outside was desperate for me to answer. I slowly left my bedroom and started walking towards the front of the house. But just as I got close to the door, the pounding suddenly stopped. The silence afterwards felt even worse. I stood there for a few seconds, listening carefully. Nothing. No footsteps, no voices, no movement outside. Eventually, I looked through the small window beside my front door. There was nobody there. I checked my driveway, the pavement, even the street, completely empty. That honestly confused me more than anything. Whoever had just been outside had either left unbelievably fast or was hiding somewhere I couldn't see. Against my better judgment, I opened the door and looked outside. Still nothing. No cars, no people, nothing at all. I locked the door again and stayed awake for another half hour, trying to make sense of what had happened. Eventually, since nothing else happened, I convinced myself it was probably some kind of prank and went back to bed. But the following night, something happened again. This time, I woke up to a completely different sound. A car horn. At first, I thought it was coming from somewhere further down the street, but it kept going. Long honks. Over and over again. It sounded close. Very close. So I got out of bed and walked back towards the front of the house. As I got near the window, I looked outside and saw a car parked in my driveway. I didn't recognize it. The headlights were off, but the horn was blaring repeatedly. Whoever was inside was clearly trying to get my attention. Because it was so dark outside, I couldn't make out who was behind the wheel. I stood there for a moment, trying to decide what to do. Finally, I unlocked the front door and opened it slightly. The second I did, the horn stopped immediately. No delay, just silence. Then the car reversed out of my driveway and sped away so quickly that I barely had time to process what had happened. Within seconds, it was gone. I didn't get the registration plate. I didn't see the driver. Nothing. At that point, I was certain it had to be the same person from the previous night. But I had absolutely no idea why someone was doing this. I considered calling the police then, but honestly, I felt ridiculous trying to explain it. Nothing had technically happened. No break-in, no damage. Just someone deliberately messing with me. So against my better judgment, I let it go. A couple of nights passed with nothing unusual, and I started thinking maybe it was finally over. Then one morning, as I was leaving for work, I opened my front door and immediately noticed something taped to it. A folded note. I pulled it off and unfolded it. Inside, written in black ink, were 5 words. I'll be back next week. That was it. Nothing else. No name. No explanation. No joke. Nothing. That was enough for me. I finally went to the police and reported everything, including the note. They took it seriously enough to file a report, although one officer suggested it might just be someone playing a prank. Maybe, but it certainly didn't feel like one. The following week, I barely slept. Every sound outside made me nervous. I kept checking the windows, checking the locks, and expecting something to happen again. But strangely, nothing ever did. No more banging, no more car, no more notes. And to this day, I still have no idea who was outside my house those nights, or what they wanted. A few years ago, I was living alone in a one-bedroom apartment on the 4th floor of an older building. The place itself wasn't bad at all. It was actually pretty quiet, and for the most part, I enjoyed living there. I only stayed for about a year because that was the length of my lease, but something happened near the end of it that made me certain I wasn't renewing. One night, sometime around 11 p.m., I was getting ready to go to bed. My usual routine was simple. I'd turn off the lights in the kitchen, check that my front door was locked, and then close the blinds in my living room before going to sleep. My living room had a large glass sliding door that led to a tiny balcony overlooking the parking lot below. My car was parked almost directly in view, which was convenient because I could usually see it clearly from upstairs. That night, as I was reaching to close the blinds, I happened to glance down at the parking lot and noticed someone standing beside my car. At first, I assumed maybe it was just someone walking by or looking for their own vehicle. But after a few seconds, I realized the man wasn't just standing there. He was checking my car. He walked around it slowly, looked through the windows, and then tried opening the driver's side door. That immediately got my attention. Without really thinking, I slid open the balcony door and stepped outside. I called down to him and said something like, "Hey, that's my car." The second I said that, the man stopped and looked up at me. He didn't seem startled at all. That's what made the whole thing feel strange. Normally, if someone is messing with a car and gets caught, you'd expect them to run off or at least pretend they had the wrong vehicle. But he didn't do either. He just stood there, staring up at me for several long seconds. I remember asking him what he was doing, but he never answered, not a word. Eventually, he started walking away from my car. For a second, I felt relieved, assuming he was finally leaving. But instead of heading toward the street or another part of the lot, he started walking directly toward my apartment building. That was the moment I got uncomfortable. From where I was standing, I could see him approach the entrance, but once he got close enough, he disappeared from my view. I couldn't tell if he actually went inside or kept walking. Still, something about it didn't sit right with me. I went back inside, locked the balcony door, shut the blinds, and tried to brush it off. Maybe he lived there, I told myself. Maybe I was overreacting. But not even 2 minutes later, I heard movement outside my apartment door. Then I heard my doorknob move, just slightly, like someone was trying to open it. I froze. I walked quietly toward the living room and stared at the front door from a distance, just listening. A few seconds later, it happened again. This time, more deliberate. Someone was definitely testing the handle. My heart started pounding. I checked to make sure the door was locked, which thankfully it was, and after a few quiet moments, I slowly leaned forward to look through the peephole. Standing outside my apartment was the exact same man I had just seen next to my car. He was standing completely still, facing my door. I stepped back immediately. A few seconds later, He knocked, not loudly, just 3 slow knocks. I didn't answer, obviously. I just stood there silently, waiting for him to leave. After about 20 or 30 seconds, I heard footsteps moving away. Eventually, everything went quiet again. I barely slept that night. For the next few weeks, I was constantly on edge whenever I came home. Then, maybe a month later, I saw him one more time. I had just gotten home from work and walked into the building lobby. I got into the elevator and pressed my floor. Right before the doors closed, I looked down the hallway and saw him. Same clothes, same face. He had clearly seen me too, because he immediately started walking faster toward the elevator, then faster, almost running. Luckily, the door shut before he got there. I remember just staring at the closing doors, hoping they would close faster. When I got to my floor, I rushed to my apartment, locked the door behind me, and stayed inside the rest of the night. He never came back to my door after that, and I never saw him again. But I moved out 2 months later, and to this day, I still think about how easily that night could have gone very differently. I used to live in an old apartment when I was younger. It was actually an old house that had been converted into a duplex. My side had a small kitchen, a living room, 1 bedroom, and a bathroom. There was also a staircase leading down to a tiny entrance area and the front door. On the other side of the building was another apartment with a very similar layout, although I never really knew who lived there. I stayed in that apartment for several months. It was cheap, close to my workplace, and convenient enough. Other than that, there was nothing particularly special about it. For the first month or so, everything was completely normal. I worked long hours, so I wasn't home very often, and whenever I was there, I never had any issues. But after a while, something strange started happening. There were a few nights when I noticed I had been waking up in the middle of the night. The first time, I didn't think much of it. I simply woke up for no obvious reason, then went straight back to sleep. The second time was slightly different. I remember waking up because I thought I heard some kind of noise. But when I sat up and listened, there was nothing. No movement, no sound, just silence. Eventually, I lay back down and fell asleep again. At the time, I didn't think too deeply about it, but it was unusual for me. I normally slept very well and almost never woke up during the night. Then, within the same week, it happened a third time. Again, I woke up suddenly with the strong feeling that I had heard something. I sat up in bed and listened carefully. Still nothing. That was when it started to bother me. I couldn't tell if I was imagining things, hearing noises in my sleep, or if something was actually waking me up. After a while, with no explanation, I went back to sleep. Then, one night, things escalated. I woke up again. This time, I don't remember hearing a sound first. What I do remember is how instantly awake I felt. Not groggy, not confused, wide awake. As if something had triggered me to wake up. I stayed lying down for a moment, then slowly rolled over to face the rest of the room. Everything was completely dark. Then I heard it. A quiet creaking sound. Very small, but unmistakable. It sounded exactly like my bedroom door being opened slowly. I stared toward the doorway, and then I saw it. The door was opening. Slowly, very slowly. A figure appeared in the gap. Then someone stepped into my room. It was a man. Because of how dark it was, I couldn't make out any details of his face. He only took a single step inside and then stopped. He didn't come any closer. He just stood there. I was completely frozen, too scared to move, too scared to even breathe properly. It was so dark that I honestly couldn't tell if he knew I was awake or not. Then, after a few seconds, the man reached into his pocket and pulled something out. A camera. A second later, a bright flash lit up the room. He had taken a picture of me. That was the moment pure panic hit me. Before I could react, he stepped backwards and disappeared into the hallway again. A moment later, I heard faint creaking sounds from outside my room. Then another sound, a door opening and closing, quietly. After that, silence, complete silence. I sat there in bed for what felt like forever, probably 10 or 15 minutes, just staring at the doorway, terrified he might come back. Eventually, when I hadn't heard anything for a long time, I forced myself to get out of bed. I checked my bedroom first. Nothing. Then I slowly stepped into the hallway and turned on the light. Still nothing. No sounds, no movement, no sign of anyone. I checked every room in the apartment. My place was very small, so it didn't take long to realize the person was gone. Then I reached the far end of the upstairs hallway near a closet across from my bedroom. That's when I figured out what had happened. There was an old connecting door leading directly into the neighboring apartment. I had been told when I moved in that the door was no longer used and was permanently locked. It was painted the same color as the wall, and there was even a small table with a lamp placed in front of it, so it barely looked like a door at all. But now it all made sense. The man had clearly entered through that door. Apparently, while it may have been locked from my side, it wasn't locked from the other side. I didn't sleep at all that night. The following morning, I contacted building management immediately and reported everything. I also started searching for another apartment that same day. For the next several nights, I stayed at a friend's house. Eventually, management investigated, and it turned out there really was a man living in the neighboring apartment. He was caught soon afterwards. Thankfully, he never entered my apartment again. Looking back, I'm almost certain the earlier nights when I kept waking up were probably the nights he had already been inside, and I was only waking when he quietly left through that connecting door. To this day, I still cannot forget the sight of that man standing silently in my bedroom doorway. It remains the creepiest experience of my entire life.